Good morning. My presentation is about spatial design in community-oriented housing, and it is based on a study that we did. I come from the School of Architecture at Tampere University of Technology, and we did a study on European co-housing in 2011 and 2012. And before I tell you more about the study, what we did, I will briefly tell you about the situation in Finland right now, situation with community-oriented housing, so that you know a little bit where we come from. I guess maybe Lisa will then afterwards tell more detailed about the Finnish case. My further examples will be mostly from other European countries, but I'll start with the Finnish current situation. In Finland, co-housing is okay, maybe I start with the concepts actually. I'm talking about both co-housing and community-oriented housing, and by co-housing, I don't mean I refer to a wider collection of all kinds of collaborative and collective housing, not only co-housing in a way McCammond and Darrett have defined it. So it's a wider term that I'm using. And even as a wider concept, I am using community-oriented housing to avoid the confusion between what co-housing refers to sometimes. But in this presentation, I will be talking about both, but mostly about community-oriented housing in a wide sense of the term. But okay, in Finland, all kinds of community-oriented housing is marginal and not familiar to most of the population. We are not like Sweden, where there is a lot of co-housing. We are sort of far behind. But right now, what I'm seeing is an increasing interest for community-oriented housing all around the country. We have new interesting buildings being built, right, like this one in Helsinki, Malta, co-housing, right in the center of the city, or elsewhere in Finland, in a smaller town in Middle Finland, this Omatoimi, that's in planning phase. I don't know if it's being built yet. But right now we have a few interesting examples under construction or in the planning, and especially senior co-housing has stimulated a lot of interest. Maybe because, okay, the population is aging, as it is elsewhere in the Western countries as well. And we have one really successful example that has been widely published. It's this one here, Loppukiri, senior co-housing in Helsinki, that was built 2006. And it has given example to, for example, this project and many others. The previous wave of development took place in the 1980s and beginning of 1990s, and here is one example of that. That's in Middle Finland, Jyväskylä. It's called Tuulenkylä co-housing. Then at that time, it was mostly that low-rise typology with a separate common house, housing typically a kindergarten and some common space for the residents. And now, as you see, the more recent developments, they are a bit more urban in their nature and location. However, okay, despite these few interesting examples, co-housing is still really a marginal phenomenon in Finland. But on the other hand, we do have a kind of tradition of sharing spaces together with neighbors. In normal blocks of flats, like these ones here, we used to have common saunas, common laundries, common storage facilities, common courtyards. That was the normal way to do it. But in recent years, these have been more and more replaced by private amenities. Believe it or not, we have private saunas inside almost all newly built flats. No, even in the smallest ones. So there is a kind of polarization going on at the moment. In the mainstream housing construction, it's ever decreasing the amount of shared spaces. And on the other hand, we have a new interest for more communal way of living. And to understand what this is about and to show the wider audience what community-oriented housing is about, what does it look like, how is the housing culture in such way of living, how can these projects be implemented and built in Finland. We set up a project called Monikko, and we studied, of course, the Finnish examples as well, but mostly we focused on the examples in other European countries because in Finland there are so few of them. What we did, first of all, we sent a questionnaire, an online questionnaire to almost 150 different kinds of communities all around Europe. The questionnaire was about really basic information about the buildings, the residents, the common life, common spaces, common activities, and also about the planning process of these communities. We got 41 answers back, and based on the questionnaire we then selected 10 different communities for more detailed study, and in these 10 communities we then conducted group interviews and spatial analysis. And that 10 plus 17 here means that, okay, we had 10 communities that we visited, and in addition to that, we also visited 17 communities in Finland and in Denmark, where we also met the residents, did some spatial analysis, but the interviews were not as structured as these 10 other ones because we had a bigger group of people joining these excursions. So based on the study, we wrote a book about really community-oriented housing. It's here, I can show it to you later. It's unfortunately only in Finnish to serve its purpose in Finland. So it's a book about co-housing cultures, the buildings, the people, and all that. But from now on in my presentation, I will focus only on spatial issues. So we studied space. We were both. It's two of us, and we are both architects. So our interest is in the spatial design. And what is interesting in all kinds of community-oriented housing is, of course, the shared space. So that was in the focus of our study. All the developments that we visited had some shared space, but the amount varied a lot. At the modest level, it was only shared outdoor space and shared circulation space like staircases and such. And at the other end, there were some communities that had almost as much shared space as they had private space, which is, of course, a lot. And everything in between. In the analysis, we looked at the nature and the use of shared spaces, whether they are purposely built, sort of formal shared spaces, kitchens, laundries, dining rooms, or more informal in their nature, meaning corridors, staircases, outdoor spaces. We also looked at how they are located and how they are connected to private and public spaces. There are many ways to do that. First of all, these shared spaces, they can be centralized in one building or one place, or they can be decentralized. They can be placed as sort of a buffer between private and public, facing the public spaces, public streets or public other spaces, or they can be located as an inner core of the sort of inwards turning structure. And again, the connections between private and shared, that can be outdoor connection, indoor connection, vertical, horizontal. There are many ways to study that. And then we looked at the size of the sharing group, whether the spaces are shared by only the closest neighbors or the entire community, or do they even have some public character. And based on this, we identified 5 different types of spatial organization. And I will now briefly, 1 minute per each, I think, go through of them. We named them after their dominant spatial feature, and I will explain the names here. The first one we called the courtyard. I think this is familiar to most of you. It's sort of the Danish co-housing model in many ways. And as the name suggests, the common outdoor space, common courtyard has a major role in this. It's low-rise housing that is located around a common courtyard. Most of the outdoor space is shared, and it's really important for the community. And shared spaces, they are centralized and typically located in a separate common house, like in this Danish example, and that common house is located centrally so that it's either at the entrance, like in this case, here's the parking lot and entrance, at the entrance of the community, or as an inner core of that. Here the level of privacy does not, in many cases, does not differ very much from any other low-rise housing typology. You can pretty much have your own privacy because there is outdoor space as a buffer zone between the shared and private. These are typically quite small or medium in their size. This was 20-something, it's 20, 30, maybe 40-something households. Another example, I will just really briefly show this. This is my home, that's in Finland. I'm just showing this because I want to show that it does not need a newly built development. This is 100 years old building where we have shared spaces located as an inner core for the whole community. The second type we named the village. And the dominant feature here is the clustered organization of spaces. It is divided in smaller subgroups. This is really typical in the Netherlands and well, other countries as well, but this example is from the Netherlands. And it's divided in a way that, in this case, for example, it's 4 or 5 households sharing one common room, common kitchen, laundry, and such. And then the entire community, in this case, about 50-something, households share some other common spaces. So the structure, spatial structure, is really a village-like clustered mixture of different degrees of private, common, semi-private, public spaces. So it's, in a way, it's richer in its spatial hierarchy than the first model. And these are, of course, bigger in size in order to have the variety of different types of shared spaces. Another example of that is from Denmark. I guess this is familiar to many of you. Whereas the Dutch example had only 4 to 5 households sharing one common space, here it's about 20 that share a common house, and then the entire village shares some facilities here. The third type we named the forum, and it differs from the village type in that here the shared spaces, okay, they are decentralized. They are located all around the development or the premises, but they are used by the entire group. This particular example is from Vienna, from Austria, and it's really big in size. It's 170 apartments altogether. So we're not talking about the traditional Danish North American co-housing model anymore, but this is what we would call community-oriented housing. There is a lot of shared spaces, common activities, but because of its size, there are many sort of different ways of participating in the community. And due to the decentralized placing of the shared spaces, different actions can take place simultaneously within the entire community. So I find this really an interesting model. And the name forum tries to describe the sort of opportunity for choice for the people. They can choose in which event they want to take part, or if they just want to stay as a passive observer of these events. The fourth one we named the bazaar. The name again tries to describe some of the atmosphere and the character of the spaces. These, the sort of key feature of these types is the indoor connection between private and shared spaces. This is all covered. It's covered indoor streets. It can be, okay, the layout may vary a lot, but anyway, it's the indoor connection. There is some outdoor space, but it doesn't have as big role as maybe in some other types. And again, the name, typologically, this has some similarities to maybe dormitories or hotels, but the atmosphere inside this is totally different. That's why the name bazaar, it tries to describe the lively, full of life atmosphere, full of colors, full of people atmosphere inside these indoor spaces. Here the shared spaces are, you could say they are centralized because most of them are located here, but yeah, also decentralized because it's shared space, the entire corridors and such. This is from Denmark, and the other example is again from Austria. Yes, for example, here the shared space is in the middle, and all the entrances to private apartments is through that shared space. So in the degree or level of privacy, this is quite different to the first type that I showed. Here, the common life starts right at your front door. Of course, in many cases, spatially, there are some buffer zones between the private and the common, but in a way it's different. This maybe is more communal in its way of life. And the last type is the apartment typology. Here it is also an indoor connection between the private and the common, but here the circulation is vertical, whereas in the previous model it was horizontal. Yeah, these can also be, the level of privacy can be very similar to any other apartment typology, but there is some shared space. And I think this is also really an interesting model because it's the most urban of all these. But there are some difficulties in the spatial development due to fire regulations and due to safety regulations in these high-rise typologies. So I think there is a lot to do still with these. Okay, so what do these examples show is that community-oriented housing does not require one certain typology, one certain layout, or even any certain specific shared spaces. It doesn't matter if the spaces are plenty. I mean, the purposely built formal shared spaces like this here. It's really up to the group to decide what kind of spaces for what uses and what purposes do they need. And the sense of community and possibilities for community do not actually depend that much on what these spaces are, but they depend more on some spatial qualities that were present in all the communities that we studied. And maybe two most important ones were the spatial structure that enables encounters. That's really trivial and simple, but that is one crucial thing. And another one is the possibility to control the level of privacy by spatial means. And interestingly, I think these are related to many of the talks that I've heard here so far. For example, Iris Kunz's presentation yesterday was about individualization of the society and individualization of even the communities. And I think especially the controlling one's privacy is deeply related to that. I guess I don't have much time. Okay, so I'll skip that. Okay, I will end with so we did spatial studies, spatial analysis, and spatial observations, and those that I showed, the 5 types or 5 organization models, were sort of the result of that. And then of course, we talked with the residents a lot about their spatial practices and how they use the space, how they feel about the shared space. And these two are, I think, deeply related to the design factors that I was talking about. The residents described shared space as an important arena for communication and meeting. That is trivial, but they told us that mostly they meet in the shared spaces and more particularly in the informal shared spaces. So how the corridors, staircases, courtyards, entrances, the spaces between private, public, and private, common, and public are designed are of crucial importance. And another thing that came up is that shared space can serve as a spatial, like meaning that it can give more space, actually more space to the private dwelling, or functional, meaning that shared spaces can bring more scope, different variety for, I don't know how to say this, functional variety, different functions, scopes for action for the residents, and therefore extend the private home. And yeah, I will end with this picture. These are two Dutch women who told us that their home is bigger than their house, and I think that really nicely describes the best qualities of shared spaces. Thank you.